My name is, I have a Sanskrit name, a spiritual name given to me by my spiritual master. So my name is Suhotra Swami, and I'm a disciple of His Divine Grace Srila Prabhupada, who is the founder of the Hare Krishna movement. I took initiation from him in 1971. And so for all the years since then, I have been practicing this, what we call Krishna consciousness, which is a very ancient and traditional yoga system, a particular type of yoga called Bhakti Yoga, or the yoga of devotion. And as an intimate part of this practice, of course, we sort of become re-educated, because I was educated as you were in the Western system of knowledge. So I was, you might say, re-educated in the traditional Indian way of looking at the world and looking at history. So, as I say, those studies have been going on since 1971, so I do feel I have some qualification to speak on these topics. What you need to know right off the bat is that what I'm going to be telling you today is by no means, I was just talking with your instructor here, it's by no means the mainstream point of view of history. But considering that India is a very ancient land and with a very long tradition of its own type of knowledge, education, and of course India has a very big population. So what I'm representing is not exactly marginal. I mean, it's not way out there on the fringe. Like your instructor was saying, here in Finland or in Europe, you'll be oriented to the Occidental or European way of looking at things. But if you go to India, where there are right now a population of about 1 billion people, what I would be presenting here today would not be, considered way out there. It would, of course, they also have Western education there too, but this is still very strong what I'm presenting today. So, so it's not exactly mainstream, particularly if you're oriented to the European way of looking at things. But at the same time, as I will explain in a few minutes, there has been a tradition here in Europe too that is in large agreement with what I will be talking about. So where to begin? I have to say one other thing, actually, which is kind of humorous. I can't help but say this, is that you are sitting there in Rovaniemi, and it just so happened that I was there this morning. But I had to drive all the way from Rovaniemi to Oulu to talk to you over the video. So I've been laughing about that all morning. It's kind of ironic comment on modern technology. So anyway, to begin, my reference point for world history are the Vedic texts of India. So I want to explain that for a moment. I understand we have quite a bit of time, so I can go into these things in a little bit of detail. So the word Veda, simply translated from Sanskrit, means knowledge, but it is particularly a kind of exalted knowledge, a kind of transcendental knowledge, which is not dependent upon our physical senses. Here in the West, knowledge tends to be very much dependent ultimately on empiricism, on what we can verify by seeing and by our other senses. But Vedic knowledge, while Vedic knowledge, of course, doesn't shut out empirical knowledge, it's there, but it's considered only like a beginning or first step of knowledge. And then beyond that is Anuman, which means logic or speculation, which you also have in European tradition. But then, highest of all is Shabda. Shabda means vibration, actually. So knowledge is ultimately transmitted by vibration, like I'm speaking to you, and you're hearing this, and what I am saying is conveying a knowledge which is quite mysterious, actually, when you get into it. How these words that are coming out of my mouth, how they're registering in your consciousness, giving you information. That's something that for all of our modern philosophy and science is still not really understood how that works. And this is the area that Vedic knowledge is most concerned with. This mysterious transmission of information, of even realization through sound vibration, or even thought. Thought is a sort of subtle mental vibration. So it gets into all these things which I think today there's a lot more interest in now, in the New Age and esoteric fields, and this has been the main concern of Vedic knowledge for thousands of years, literally. So, so this tradition looks at the world quite a bit differently than the way Western science and Western history presents the world. So the basis of this Vedic knowledge, I'm going to give you a term in Sanskrit, mantra vidya. Vidya simply, again, means knowledge or understanding. The words are very simple, similar, vidya and Veda. And they're related, actually. I'd like to point out our words that we use, like, for example, video. Video in Latin, I believe, means I see. But the root is vid, which means to see, perceive, understand, know. And that's the same root as Veda or Vidya. Also our word idea, the Greek ideia. So the root is id. So it's the same, you see, sound particle. So this is of interest. And this shows you what I'm getting at here is that this type of knowledge, Vedic knowledge that I'm speaking of, yes, it's still very much there in India, but it used to be elsewhere. The same principles, which I wish to explain now. Mantra vidya. Vidya meaning, again, knowledge, and mantra meaning a sound which is capable of raising our consciousness to higher levels of perception, awareness, realization. So in ancient cultures, like Egypt or Mesopotamia, which also existed at the time of the classical Vedic age in India, all of them, you see, they were oriented to what we would now call ritualism. They're very ritualistic. The government itself was a kind of ritual form with a king who represented a deity and had around him priests, and they had a whole system of worship of higher powers of the universe. And that was actually the science. It was considered a science of that time. And obviously there was something to it, because we still see today in Egypt the great pyramids, which were constructed according to a concept of science, which is still there in India today. There was a mathematician named Seidenberg who studied the old structures in India and Mesopotamia, and he showed that the basic system of proportion, using mathematical proportions that we used, are the same that are used in the temples in India. So I could give a lot of information, but I don't want to go so much into details, just to show that there was a common worldview. We're talking about, say, 5,000 years ago. The civilization of Egypt has been traced back to about 5,000 years ago. And similarly, we say the Vedic civilization was in full glory about 5,000 years ago. And the roots of Greek civilization go back also many thousands of years. So these and other old cultures, we find a lot of similarities, and this mantra vidya is a key point. which means that there are sacred sounds or a sacred language. And the language itself conveys a higher reality. And so the priests were engaged in chanting these sound vibrations, and we have this, even coming down today, the idea of the magic word. You know, even in English, so to speak, mythological culture, you have the King Arthur and the Round Table and Merlin the magician, and he'd speak magic words and wonderful things would happen. And the knights, the warrior class, were beholden to him. He's kind of like their seeing eye, their leader, their inspiration. So even this is rather recent, I think. This they trade Arthurian legends go back. It's after Christ. It's AD. So that's rather recent. But the elements there are very ancient. They can be found in, as I said, in India, in Egypt, in Mesopotamia. So this is really what I want to establish here. One very important point, this mantra vidya, this idea of higher knowledge expressed by sacred sound that is intoned by a priest, a Brahmin, a guru, who has a particular power to utter these sounds so that they manifest wonderful effects within our experience. So this was, I'm going to be bold and say this was the science of the ancient world. And now I just begin what I was indicating before. I'm going to tell you about the minority opinions here in the West that kind of supports that. So there is one book, a very interesting book. It was published in 1962 by a pair of European scholars. I've forgotten their name. One was a German, I think the other Italian. And but the name of the book is Hamlet's Mill. And what they did was they reviewed all the ancient so-called mythologies of India and Middle East and Greece and Egypt and other cultures too, European cultures. What is your local mythology? The Kalevala? Yes, Kalevala. Kalevala, yeah, Kalevala, and the so-called mythologies of Ireland and other places, even American Indian ancient stories and Polynesia. And they found so many similarities. They point out the similarities between all these diverse cultures which are separated by oceans. And then at the conclusion of the book, they ask a very provocative question. They say, can we really believe that all of these old cultures were just totally disconnected from one another when we find so many parallels there? And then they ask us to think of today. They say, today you can go to Japan, which has a different culture, different language, or the United States, or Russia, or here in Finland, or any country, and you'll find all significant cultural and linguistic differences. But when you come to science, it's all the same. When you start talking with scientists about their basic view of the material world and the laws, then you're going to come to one common platform, which is agreed upon everywhere you go. And so then they raise this a provocative question, that can we not think of these so-called mythologies of the ancient world as being a kind of body of scientific knowledge which we don't really understand today? And therefore we have this convenient word mythology, which sort of says, well, puts in the category maybe a fairy tale or something, or some old dreamy beliefs of ancient people who weren't really in touch with what's really going on. But can we really afford to look at that way? Because we find all these very remarkable similarities, a very similar way of looking at the universe, looking at the relationships of man to nature and man to higher powers of the universe. And so this was their kind of radical, they say they were actually, as scholars, putting their reputation on the line by arguing, we think that this is a science, which in those days had the same effect, or had the same value in those cultures as our science does today, our modern, more mechanistic type of science. It played the same role. created possibilities of expansion of their civilization and culture. There was a medical science. There was all the things there then that we have today, but in a rather different form, on a rather different basis. So then the science is, again, mantra video. It's based on spiritual sound. And today we have science, there's also a Sanskrit term for that, yantra vidya, which sounds similar, but yantra means machine. So our science today is based on technology, on machinery. The idea that it's a view of the world, of the universe, in fact, of nature, that everything is essentially mechanical. And all these machines have come about that we use today. Originally, there were efforts of scientists, like going back to Newton and those early scientists. They were trying to reproduce nature in machine. They were trying to prove their theories. Like Newton made a model. He was a proponent of the heliocentric model of the universe, with the sun at the center and the planets going around. So he actually made a model of that. And you could turn a crank and all the planets would go around. And this is how all this technology started, because they were looking at the universe as a great machine. Actually, Newton, he gave the example of a clock, because that was just like nowadays, I read a lot of books, so scientists, when they try to explain things like the universe or consciousness, nowadays they tend to reach to computers, and explain everything in terms of computer technology. The mind is like a computer. Now 50 years ago they couldn't do that because they didn't have computers, so they thought of some other analogy. But now it's computer. In Newton's time it was clock. The clock was the big machine, the big modern, wonderful device that saves, that we can organize our time, and, like computers today. So he tried to explain the universe as a gigantic clock, and everything working by clockwork, different gears, different levels of interaction, and all of that. So now we have computers, but you see the basis yantra vidya is looking at the world in a mechanical way. So this is very different from mantra vidya, which is much more subtle, which actually. But again, there's some fields of science which are sort of stumbled into that, like some scientists in the very cutting edge of physics, quantum physics, and that they have in their research found that you can't separate the mind from what you're observing, and some of them have even come to the conclusion that perhaps everything is mind-based. Perhaps the whole of what we call the universe is ultimately, as one Sir James Jeans, he's a British quantum physicist a few decades ago, he said, perhaps instead of looking at the universe as a great machine, we should rather look at it as a great thought or a great mind. So there are some areas of science today which seem to, as I say, sort of blunder into that very ancient way of looking at the world. So it's still with us in some ways, this ancient understanding. And as I said, in India it's very much still with us. So this is by way of prefacing. I just trying to orient you to the general worldview that I'm representing here today. And so as I said, our point of view is based on sacred sound, and this sound is recorded in we can say a vast encyclopedia of books, texts in the Sanskrit language, which are called the Vedas. And there is a department of Vedas that is about history, and this is called Purana. Purana in Sanskrit means actually ancient. And Itihasa also means, another word, means history. So that which went before, Itihasa. So there are books in this department of the Vedic texts, like this one I brought today. This is an edition of the Mahabharata. Mahabharata literally means Greater India. So this is the story of the ancient Indian civilization. You have now in Asia countries outside of India which are still sometimes referred to as Indo-China, meaning that you look at their culture and you see it is also Vedic or at least Buddhistic, but Buddhism is simply a derivation from Vedic culture and philosophy. Many things in Buddhism are in complete agreement with what we would call Hinduism, I guess, although we don't use that term. But Buddhism is a kind of Protestant movement of the traditional Vedic religion. And so as far away as Indonesia, Bali, the island of Bali, to Vietnam, the old name of Vietnam was Annam, and Anna is a Sanskrit word which means rice, so there's a lot of rice in Vietnam. And Cambodia, the old Sanskrit name is Cambodia. Burma, which comes, or Myanmar they say now, which comes from the word Brahma. Brahma is the Lord of creation, the God, four-headed God of creation, Brahma. And the priests of Brahma are the Brahmins. So Burma, which is the country just the eastern neighbor of India, that is the actual original name, Brahma, which mutated into Burma and now Myanmar. Thailand, the old name of Thailand is Siam, and that's from the Sanskrit Siam, Siama, which means black or dark. It's actually a name of God. God meaning the beautiful, dark, absolute truth. Anyway, so we see that Indian culture is not just limited to India even today. So this Mahabharata, Greater India, is about this Vedic culture which used to extend outside of India in the direction I just mentioned, the east, but also in the west. Afghanistan was actually part of that culture. You still see in place names like Kandahar, which comes from the name of Gandhari, who is a queen mentioned in this book, Mahabharata, Gandhari. And she came from this region that we now call Afghanistan. Her city was the present-day Kandahar. And then even further. And now I come to another interesting book I just happened to have with me, so I was able to bring it. This is, as I said, there's a minority opinion in the West that agrees with what we say. So this is a book called The Genius of the Few, the story of those who founded the Garden of Eden. And this is about the origins of the Mesopotamian civilization, which is, I don't know if it's still the idea, but when I was in school, I always learned that the Mesopotamian civilization, they said, is the cradle of civilization. When I was in school in the 50s and 60s, this is what we were taught, that everything started there. I don't know if that's still the idea. But anyway, he's daring to say that the Mesopotamian civilization came from somewhere else. He says it came from the east. And he doesn't directly say India, but you read between the lines what he's saying, and it's pretty obvious that's what he means. And he also gives a very radical system of dating, which goes back much further. And his name is Christian O'Brien. He's a geologist who used to work with British Petroleum, BP, in the Middle East. And he did his own investigations of the ruins there. And he, together with some scholarly friends, he translated some old Mesopotamian scriptures. And so he's come to these conclusions that the Mesopotamian civilization actually was founded about, he says, in his timeline here in the beginning of the book, he says 40,000 BC. So this is quite outside of the scope of what is considered modern acceptable history. Quite radical. But this is very much in agreement with our understanding of history, that it's much more ancient than what we're told today. And I want to explain that. I'm going to get into that, explaining the whys and the wherefores of that in a few minutes. But he's saying, it's very interesting. He's saying that the gods that were worshipped by the Sumerians and the Babylonians were actually a kind of super race of people from an earlier age, a previous age than ours, when people were much taller in stature. These are the Elohim. This is a Hebrew word which means the shining ones. So they were very effulgent and very wise, and they came from the east, and their religion was the religion of yoga, which obviously, as I said, he doesn't say India, but he does say yoga, so where else does that mean? And he says according to the ancient scriptures, the leader of these persons who were worshipped later by the Sumerians as gods, his name was Anu. He's the head god in the Babylonian or Sumerian pantheon. The leading god is named Anu, but Christian O'Brien is saying that he was a person, but not like a human, so much like human being as we know now, but a rather kind of super person of an ancient time, which we'll not see anymore. And it's very interesting. It's, just coincidental. I found this book in a bookstore in London in the 80s, and I looked to it and I said, wow, I bought it. The reason I bought it is from my own training. I know that in the Vedic scriptures like Mahabharata and others, there is the story, the narrative of an ancient king in India whose name was Yayati, and he had some sons, several sons, and some of them left India proper and started kingdoms outside of India. And the idea is that these cultures that they started, continue to exist on and developed into what we might call other civilizations, historical civilizations that we know now of ancient times. And not much is told in the Vedic scriptures about these sons who left. It just says they left and they went to different regions and they started their civilizations, and these civilizations continued on. But sort of because they're outside of the Indian focus, so not much was said about them. But I found it very interesting that he's saying that the Mesopotamian civilization was started by a person named Anu. One of the sons of this King Yayati who left India to start a civilization outside was also named Anu. So I found this is a very remarkable, I'm just saying, it's a very remarkable, at least a coincidence. And so it's interesting how this sort of, minority scholarship, it has there's a network of interesting correlations and agreements. There's also, to mention Egypt, recent times there's a Professor Shockley in America, I believe he's in Boston, and he's proposed that the Sphinx, the famous Egyptian Sphinx, must be, he says it goes back to about 20,000 BC. And he's given some very hard geologic evidence for that. He said that around the base of the Sphinx there are watermarks from the Nile. And going back to the ebb and flow of the Nile, those watermarks could have only been there at some been put there at some very, very ancient time. And so he estimates 20,000 years. And it's hard science. It's in other words, the majority or mainstream Egyptologists are not very happy with him saying this, but it's very hard for them to refute what he says, because it's hard geology he does. So this is what I'm saying. There is a body of evidence, whether you want to put your faith in it or not, that's another thing. But there is a body of evidence, hard scientific evidence, which can be brought forward to support this point of view I'm making. Another book published in the late 90s called Forbidden Archaeology was actually, which had a very large impact on archaeological sciences and paleontology, was actually written by two members of the Hare Krishna movement, who they went by their given birth names. They have Sanskrit names like me, but birth names Richard L. Thompson and Michael Cremo. And so this forbidden archaeology is, it went through the archaeological records of the last 200 years or so and showed that there's a great deal of evidence that was uncovered by very respectable scientists, geologists, paleontologists, and this evidence shows that humankind lived on this earth in much, much more ancient periods than modern science is willing to admit. But this evidence is there, and interestingly, what happened to it is that it was kind of shelved. You know, it did not fit the predominant paradigm, which is Darwinian evolution, which says, you know, civilization is rather recent, and say before 100,000 years ago or 200,000 years ago, there weren't what we would recognize to be Homo sapiens on the earth at all. Rather, there were, you know, I don't know, Neanderthal men or something else, Picanthropus or whatever they call them, sort of like ape men, and they didn't have civilization. They were just, you know, kind of a advanced form of gorilla or whatever you want to say, missing link or something. And so modern, according to this scenario, the modern human form species came about with the Cro-Magnon man, which is rather recent. I think is what, 50, 60, 40,000 years ago, Cro-Magnon men started to appear and flourish. And then civilization hardly goes back more than 5,000 years. So this has been this was the you know, the mainstream paradigm, but there's a lot of evidence that has been dredged up by these two authors of forbidden archaeology. This means evidence, as I said, it's in scientific journals, it's on the, you know, the back shelves of dusty university libraries somewhere, you know, in research institutes, you know, the stuff that, you know, has been just shut up and locked up and no one wants to talk about. So they actually did the detective work of digging up this stuff, and they, you know, there's all this evidence of what we would say modern human skeletons, indistinguishable from modern man, but they were found in strata of geology, which puts them literally in millions of years ago. Millions of years old. There were cases of human skull found in a coal mine. Can you imagine? You know, coal mine, they go very deep under the earth. They're digging up coal, which according to science is compressed vegetable matter. It was formed into coal millions and millions of years ago in previous geological ages. And in the midst of that, they found a human skull. You know, so a modern type of human skull. So, you know, this is it's very hard to say it was a hoax unless a miner brought, you know, under his coat the human skull and just stuck it there. But apparently it was, you know, it was very in a very proper way dug up, and there were witnesses and so on. And this skull is now on display in some museum in Germany. So there's a lot of evidences like that. Also findings of artifacts, things that were made by human beings in very deep strata of the earth. So it's there, the evidence. And you know, the argument of forbidden archaeology, this book, is that you know, it can be shown that the scientists were strong proponents of the Darwinian point of view. And then they just put more stress on geological evidence that supports that theory. And the evidence that doesn't support the theory gets filtered out. It doesn't appear in the textbooks that are, you know, in universities. It's just shelved somewhere. And so these two authors are saying that, so if there was another paradigm, say the paradigm that there were human beings on this earth for millions and millions of years, you could have this, you know, just as strong evidence at your disposal. If you opened up the old shelves and took out, you would have the same physical evidence of the same strength as what is there to argue the Darwinian point of view. So it's a very, you see, ultimately what they're saying is that our view of the world is not determined by physical evidence. It's determined first of all by ideas and theories. And then we go about collecting evidence and putting it together to support the ideas and theories which are in vogue. And this is very valid. This is something that is more and more recognized in the intellectual world of men today. So anyway, getting down to the nitty-gritty of the Vedic outlook on history, what we learn is just as we see in the period of 1 year, any 1 year, you have 4 seasons, and year after year these seasons are in cycle. So you start with spring, then summer, then fall, and then winter. And in the winter time, you see everything is covered by snow. Everything becomes covered up. You don't see the world as you do in the other 3 ages. And then when spring comes again, the snow melts. This is an example that's particularly appropriate here in Finland, where you have a lot of snow. So snow melts, and then you see the good old world again. The world as we like to see it. In the same way, the Vedas tell us that there are 4 great, what are called yugas, or great ages. And or the human race, or the world, cycles through these 4 ages, and they're repetitive. And these are ages that are measured in terms of millions or hundreds of thousands of years, so they're very, very long. And of course, the Vedas, they have a very elaborate cosmic time scale. These 4 repeating ages, and they're collected together to make days of, what are called days of Brahma. They're days, but they're days of a higher time scale, not the days as we experience them. Which is interesting, which is also useful when you're trying to understand something like in the beginning of the Bible, in the book of Genesis, where you find statements, God says, so what does that term mean, day? You see, especially before the creation of the world. If before the sun was created, or how do you measure a day? So the Vedas say there are different levels of time, and so a day, this day of Brahma, is 4,300,000,000 solar years. So a lot can take place in one of those days. A world could be created in one of those days. And then these days are collected in years, and then finally the whole universe is measured according to the 100 years of Brahma, which works out to about 320 trillion years. So the Vedas, the sages of the Vedas were dealing with such colossal conceptions of time. And so they were viewing the history of the world in very, very, very long ages. So at present, we are in the 4th age, or the winter age, which is called Kali Yuga, the age of coral. And in this age, as I said, think of the winter, the snow falls and covers everything up. So in this age, most of the evidence of any previous ages are covered up. They're covered up, first of all, by the ignorance of the colossal and arrogant ignorance of modern human man, who thinks that he is, his civilization is like the crown of everything that has ever happened. So this is a kind of short-sightedness, and it's just this very attitude. As I was talking about the knowledge filter, filtering out all evidence that there was ever anything before. So this is contributing to this covering of everything. But also in physical ways, the world has changed due to the influence of this age, and so many things are literally covered up by the earth, and sometimes we find them when we dig in the earth. So this Kali Yuga, winter age, is a time of ignorance and great materialism. As I said, this yantra vidya, this machine knowledge, mechanical knowledge is very highly developed, but from the Vedic point of view, that's not really considered bona fide knowledge. That's not the type of knowledge that really helps you have insight into the real nature of the world. And so that ancient science is largely not understood, not known, not in practice today. So, but there were previous ages, these 3 previous ages. The one previous is called Dwapara Yuga, then Treta Yuga, then the first age was Satya Yuga. And it's interesting to note the Vedic view on what we would call civilization. It is very akin to the old Greek idea of civilization. You notice your instructor has told me that you haven't really gotten into any old civilizations yet. But the civilization of ancient Greece as we know it, with the old philosophers like Socrates and Plato, they were not very oriented to urban development. I mean, they did have cities, but they were called city-states. A city was a kind of a rare thing. You know, Athens, Sparta. Basically, the culture at that time was village or rural countryside. And the sages themselves, they would have their schools out in the woods. They would teach under a grove of trees, and their students would come and hear them, because that was considered to be, that atmosphere was considered to be most conducive for learning. And this is very, very Vedic, I must say. That the Vedic view of civilization gives value to what in Sanskrit is called sattva guna, the mode of goodness, which is unspoiled nature. So the wise men, or the wise people, men and women of those earlier ages, they actually didn't like to live in cities. Cities were there, but they were few and far between. This city life is considered in the rajoguna, the mode of passion. That's easily understandable. That's where people come together for commerce, for business, for trade, making money. And the wise persons of old would look down upon that. In fact, in ancient Greece, there's a philosophical analogy to illustrate this point of view. It concerns the Olympics, and it's to explain 3 classes of people, 3 classes of mentality. So they say there's the Olympics, and 3 kinds of people come there. There are those who come to observe, to watch, and they're considered the best. They're the observant ones, the ones who are studying the world. And then there are those who come to compete, to race, you see, to strive in the Olympic Games. So they're the second class. They're more in this passionate mode, trying to accomplish physical goals. And then the third class are those who simply come to buy and sell, because around the Olympics there would be a marketplace and a good opportunity to trade and do some business. So this is a ancient and traditional way of looking at different mindsets, and it's in agreement. That point of view in ancient Greece is upheld in India. So the best of men were the Brahmanas, the thinkers, the philosophers, who had the kind of, I use a fancy word, cosmoptic view of the world. Cosmoptic means looking at the whole cosmos, not just looking at the city of Oulu and what's happening here, but relating that to the greater universe and understanding the laws of nature that are at work and the controllers of these laws of nature and the ultimate truth behind everything. So these Brahmins, they would congregate in the forest. They had their ashrams in the forest, and they lived in harmony with nature. And this is where they trained their students. And then there were cities, as I said. And these are more places of passion, places of government, places where the king would be in his court. And but the city people, the king and all of the people under him, they were very obedient to these Brahmins. They were the sages, so they would send their children to the schools in the forest to get education. When there was some difficult problem that had to be solved by higher knowledge, they would go out to the forest and consult with the sages. So really, and the farther back we go in this cycle of history, when we go back to the first age, practically the whole human society was just sages. They were in this category of wise, thoughtful people who just lived, and there weren't very many human beings either, because to be a human being, this brings in the doctrine of karma. So I think you might have heard this word. So one takes a birth according to karma. So in those days, to get a human birth, that was a very rare thing. You had to be very highly qualified for a soul to earn that birth in that form. So there were not many human beings, and they lived out in the forest. They didn't really care for cities or building permanent structures at all. They were enwrapped in meditation and contemplation of higher truths. So you can see, I hope you can see the consequences of what I'm saying, that this way of looking at history does not contradict the physical evidence that we have of what was going on in the old world, in the ancient world, or prehistoric times. We say that man was there, but he wasn't the type of man who builds big cities and leaves piles of garbage around for modern day archaeologists to dig up and investigate. It was just a different class of man on a different level of consciousness. And then as we go through these ages, getting closer to now, then it becomes gradually more acidified, more materialistic, and there you'll start to find more evidence of great ancient structures, pyramids. This pyramidical type or temple civilization is already a sign of a kind of degradation from an even greater, higher ideal of the very ancient past. So so this is how we come to modern times, and modern times is totally machine-oriented, building-oriented, very physical, very much into manipulating matter, which again was looked down upon by the great wise persons, scientists of the ancient past. So this Mahabharata, this text describes the history of Greater India building up to a war, the Mahabharata War, which was fought at a place called Kurukshetra, which is still there in India, northern India. It's a great field. And it used to be a place of ancient sacrifice. And in those days, as a part of the urban civilization, city civilization, they did have a military class, they did have armies, and they did have wars, but military action in those days was very ritualized. It was considered also to be a type of sacrifice, a sacrifice at arms. And so they had very strict rules concerning how wars could be fought. I mean, there was absolutely no scope for dropping bombs on cities, and blowing up innocent people. That would be considered, that would horrify a warrior of those times. They would take their armies out to some open field where no people lived, and they would fight. They had their ranks of soldiers, and they would only fight with each other because they were warriors of equivalent skill, and they would fight with each other. And then when the sun went down, the fighting would begin in the morning, and when the sun went down in the evening, then the fighting would stop. And they would actually mix. It was more like a sports team, that both sides would mix together. And how are you doing? And we had a good fight today, didn't we? They'd have a big feast and clap each other on the back. See you tomorrow. Hope you're ready. And so again, a very different way of looking at things and doing things, as described here. So there was a great war at Kurukshetra about 5,000 years ago, which is said to have brought armies from outside of India as well, because in this Vedic or Indian civilization was expanded well beyond the borders of India. So you find that there were Yava. Yava doesn't mean Java on the east side of India, but actually Yava is the old name for Greece. So the Yavanas, the Greeks, were there. The Syrians are mentioned, and people from the Chinese area of, it was called China, were there. So this was a contest of to decide the fate of the world, the known world at that time. And as a result of the Mahabharata war, many soldiers were killed. Many cultures were actually, old cultures were actually erased at that time. Their leading personalities were killed on the battlefield, and so their cultures withered and sort of dried up. So this 5,000 years ago marked, this is the beginning of this modern age, what we call the Kali Yuga. There was this war marked a great shift in the consciousness of men, of people at that time. And so after this war was fought, then the world started to get on this track, this sort of materialistic track, and leaving behind the wisdom of the ancient world and so-called progressing towards what we have now. So this is, yes, in essence, this is our view of the foundations of civilization. I could also mention that we have the Judeo-Christian civilization in Europe and America, which is I think we could safely say the predominant culture, and has been for quite a while. And the origins of that are interesting too. And this I can support with the evidence from Western history too, and not all that marginal, not all that on the edge of things. Because one of the significant features of these religions, Judaism, Christianity, and also Islam, they actually form a family of religious beliefs which are rooted more or less in the same view of the world, the same prophets, Moses, Abraham. So what is in common with these three great religions is that what is called religious dualism, in that they posit a good and an evil in opposition. There's God, good, and then there's, the Christians say Satan, the devil. In Islam he's called shaitan. Similar in Hebrew also, actually the word Satan comes from Hebrew. So he's an anti-God. We have words in our language like anarchy, which anarchy, arche in Greek means order. There's the word hierarchy, the holy order, headed by this God, this deity, Yahweh or Jehovah or Allah, and his angels, and there's a hierarchy, a holy order governing the universe. But then, like a mirror image down below in darkness, there's an anarchy. And that's the original sense of the word anarchy. Now anarchist means that's a political point of view that wants to get rid of government entirely. But originally anarchy means an anti-rule, an anti-order that was headed by Satan, or the Lord of Darkness, the devil. And so this type of religious outlook is called dualism, religious dualism, an opposition of good and evil. And modern historians of religion are in agreement. They're in agreement that the earliest known form of this religious dualism is to be found in Zoroastrianism, which is the ancient religion of Persia. modern-day Iran. The word Iran, by the way, comes from the Sanskrit word Arya. Arya, that word was misused by the Nazis. Yeah, Aryans, they totally misused it. Arya in Sanskrit means a civilized person. And it actually is not properly applied to any race. It just means a person who follows this Vedic culture that I've been talking about. When you go to India, it's very interesting about India. India is a very interesting place because you actually see in India all the races. It's a very amazing thing. You find examples of what we would call Caucasian person who is light skinned as, say, Italians or Greeks in Europe. And then you have very dark persons, as dark as the Africans, in South India especially, in Tamil Nadu. You have Oriental persons who look Chinese. And you have all the races there. And they're all indigenous to India. I mean, there's no history that they came at some time outside. They're always there. So this indicates, this also indicates a very great civilization. When you, I'm from America, so I'm not blowing the American horn, but I think it's understood that America is the leading nation of the world today. So be that as it may, when you go to America, you see all kinds of people out there because it's a great civilization. So it has room for all different kinds of people. That's the idea. Like Rome was like that too. Rome was an empire, and there were all kinds of people, Africans and Middle East people, all of them congregated in Rome. So similarly, India, we see, this is indicative of a very ancient, great civilization which attracted people from everywhere to live. So this is actually the meaning of Arya. Arya means one who follows the culture, the Vedic culture. It has nothing to do with the color of skin or color of eyes or shape of head. This was, this is something totally foreign and very recent in European history. So anyway, I was talking about Iran, which is the modern day name for Persia. So Iran comes from Arya. Iran also used to be connected to the ancient civilization of India. They have their oldest scriptures called Zend-Avesta, which is the scriptures of the Zoroastrian religion. And it's written in the Avestan language, which is practically a dialect of Sanskrit. There's so many similar words. And the general view of the Zoroastrian religion is the same as India, but in some ways it's changed. And one important way that it has changed is the introduction of this dualism. Because there you have also a god called Ahura Mazda, who is the god of light and goodness. And he's opposed by an anti-god called Ahriman. And we find, it's interesting, in the Avestan scriptures of ancient Iran and in the Vedic scriptures, the Rig Veda, you find the evidence of a debate that went on in very ancient times between the sages of the Orthodox Vedic point of view and this Zoroastrian point of view. That there was a split. And there was this Zoroaster, he was a sage of Persia. And he's there in the Vedic scriptures. He's mentioned, his lineage is mentioned. And they were the priest, he was the head of a Brahmin caste called the Magas in India. In Persia they're known as the Magi, and it is said that the three wise men were the three Magi who went to Persia to see Christ. So this Zoroaster, he introduced this dualism, this opposition of good and evil, and that there will be in the future a conflict, a kind of Armageddon between the forces of good and the forces of evil, and then good will triumph. And he introduced the idea of resurrection, that people who had been buried, they will be brought back to life in their bodies and be judged, and those who are judged as good, then they will live for it, they will inherit the earth. He introduced the idea of a coming Messiah, called in the Western language Sayusant, I think. And someone who is going to start this, by his appearance there would be this great conflict between good and evil. And the Vedic sages, headed by a sage called Vashishta, who's mentioned both in the Rig Veda and in the Zend Avesta. Vashishta. He was very much opposed to this. He was arguing with Zoroaster. This is something new. You're introducing some new ideas here. We don't agree with that. So then there came this split, and there came these two distinguishable religions at some point: the Vedic religion and the Zoroastrian religion, which, as again, shares many things. The language is very similar. The general worldview, the names of different deities are very similar. But one big difference is this dualism. So it is said that in ancient times, the Jews, when they were in exile, that they stayed for some time in Persia. And I read in standard accounts of history, I'm not talking about Indian sources, I'm talking about Western sources, that it's thought that the Jews picked up this dualism from the Zoroastrians, and they got this idea also of a good God opposed by a devil, and then that came into Christianity and into Islam. So I just wanted to mention this, that there is from my point of view, there's a kind of link to everything around the world. So okay, I'm going to stop here. I think we wanted to pause at some point, and I don't know if you want to take a break. I'm turning it over to you right now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you for your very interesting, very fascinating in many ways commentary. Is that when we go into, I'm sure that the students will be, when we go through the processes from a Western point of view, looking at the other way, from the hunter-gatherer, from the primitive to the developed, and of course, is that we usually take a look and say that, is it so? Is that I'm not much of a non-traditionalist, that do not accept just because traditional sources say something that it is like this. But we'll be considering these words, and I've taken many notes here to consider when we're taking a look at alternative points of view. And thank you for your voice. Is that the multitude of voices is always good in historical study, to just that is that we don't have one predominant, one strong voice that comes and says that this is the truth and there's nothing else but that. Is that we do welcome that, and our class enjoys that too. So thank you very much. We are out of time. You were able to fill
out of time entirely.
Yes, we are out of time entirely. It's 1:45, and that means that I have to run to the next lesson across the city, and these students have to then continue with their next lesson in 10 minutes. So, okay, so we will see each other tomorrow then. Okay. Thank you for your attention.